There are records that sit in the archives of the Pacific Northwest, not because they are classified, but because they simply do not fit into the official history of the region. They are the leftovers of a bureaucratic era, tucked away in folders labeled with mundane titles like Environmental Survey 1968 or Site Maintenance Logs. If you look closely at the margins of these reports, you find the handwriting of men who saw things they couldn't explain through the lens of physics or architecture. It is a quiet history of a place that was supposed to be empty, and a structure that refused to obey its own blueprints. The coastal road leading to the airfield was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt, swallowed on both sides by the dense, dripping greenery of the Olympic Peninsula. In the winter of 1968, the fog didn't just hang in the air, it seemed to grow out of the very ground, thick and tasting of salt and pine needle decay. Arthur Vance, a senior surveyor for the Department of Defense, drove his government-issued sedan through the gray veil, his headlights barely cutting more than 20 feet ahead. He had been sent to conduct a routine pre-disposal assessment of a facility that hadn't seen a landing strip light in over a decade. When he reached the perimeter, the chain-link fence was a skeletal remains of rusted wire and climbing ivy, holding back a forest that seemed eager to reclaim the concrete. The gate groaned on its hinges, its weary voice drifting across the silent, flat expanse of the tarmac. Arthur stepped out of his car, the quiet of the abandoned base settling around him, pressing close until the only sound was the soft, steady drip of moisture from the eaves of a nearby barracks. He checked his clipboard, noting that the facility was officially listed as dormant, though the air felt strangely heavy, as if the site itself were holding its breath. The airfield consisted of 3 main runways and a cluster of corrugated steel buildings that had long ago faded from olive drab to a ghostly, mottled gray. The place felt still, as if time itself moved a little more slowly here. Hangar 12 sat at the far western edge of the property, positioned slightly away from the others and partially obscured by a stand of wind-bent hemlocks. As Arthur walked toward it, he noticed that the local wildlife seemed to avoid the immediate vicinity of the structure. There were no bird calls coming from the trees nearby, and the soft mud around the hangar's foundation showed no tracks of deer or small rodents. He approached the massive sliding doors of Hangar 12, moving with quiet purpose toward the heavy iron chain and the padlocked bar that seemed so much newer than the rest of the facility's aging hardware. The concrete apron before him was strangely clean, untouched by the weeds and moss that had broken through every other inch of the base's pavement. Arthur lifted his camera, the brief flash casting a soft glow across the dull metal of the doors and the smooth, almost unnatural texture of the ground beneath his feet. He reached for his keys. Feeling a slight vibration in the metal handle, a small tremor, he told himself, was only the wind. The end. Upon entering, the air inside the hangar was unnervingly still, and several degrees warmer than the freezing coastal mist outside. Arthur clicked on his heavy industrial flashlight, the beam sweeping across a vast, empty floor that should have been covered in dust and debris. Instead, the concrete was polished to a dull shine, reflecting the light in long, distorted streaks. In the center of the space sat 3 large crates and an old hydraulic press, all of them looking oddly slumped, as if they had been softened by an invisible weight. As he moved closer to the equipment, Arthur's light revealed the thermal scars mentioned in the preliminary brief, though they looked nothing like fire damage. The concrete floor around the hydraulic press was scorched in perfectly circular patterns, the surface turned to a glass-like substance that felt cold to the touch. The press itself had not been burned. It had been fused, its heavy steel components merged into a single, seamless block of metal. There were no soot marks on the ceiling and no evidence of an accelerant, just the silent, molecular union of industrial machinery. The end. Arthur knelt to examine the fused metal, noting that the serial numbers on the side of the press were warped and stretched, as if the steel had flowed like wax before hardening instantly. He pulled out his field journal and began sketching the patterns on the floor, his pen scratching loudly in the absolute vacuum of the room. He felt a sudden, sharp, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind that comes from the realization that one is being watched from a darkened corner. He swung his light toward the back of the hangar, but the beam only found the flat, featureless expanse of the rear wall. The end. The back wall of Hangar 12 was constructed of reinforced concrete blocks, standard for the era, but as Arthur approached it, he noticed a discrepancy in his peripheral vision. He paced out the length of the interior, counting his steps with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years in the field. When he reached the corner, the measurement in his head didn't match the exterior dimensions he had noted during his walk-around. According to his calculations, the interior of the hangar was roughly 6 feet shorter than it appeared to be from the outside. He walked back to the entrance and checked his external notes again, his brow furrowed in the dim light of his flashlight. The exterior wall was a straight line of weathered siding, but the interior wall felt like a false front, a secondary skin added to the building for reasons unknown. He tapped on the concrete blocks with the butt of his flashlight, expecting the dull thud of solid masonry. Instead, he heard a faint metallic resonance, a hollow ring that suggested a void existed behind the heavy structure. The end. Determined to find the source of the measurement error, Arthur climbed a rusted utility ladder that led to a narrow catwalk overlooking the hangar floor. From this height, the thermal scars below formed a geometric sequence that looked less like an accident and more like a map or a set of coordinates. The shadows cast by the fused machinery lengthened across the floor, swaying slightly even though the air remained dead and motionless. He sat on the metal grating, his legs dangling over the edge, and listened to the low, rhythmic humming that seemed to be vibrating through the catwalk supports. The sound was not mechanical. It lacked the erratic clicking of an engine or the hum of an electrical transformer. It was a steady, low-frequency pulse, moving gently through the air, as though rising from deep within the rear wall he had just inspected. Arthur pulled a small compass from his pocket and watched as the needle spun lazily in a full circle, unable to find a true north within the confines of the building. He recorded the time, 14:22, and noted that his own wristwatch had stopped moving entirely, the second hand frozen between 2 ticks. Descending the ladder, he returned to the rear wall and began to trace the mortar lines with a small screwdriver, looking for a seam or a hidden access point. In the corner, where the floor met the wall, he found a small, circular vent that had been plugged with lead wool. He pried the material loose, and a sudden draft of air whistled out of the hole, smelling of ozone and old, dry parchment. It was a sharp, biting cold that didn't match the warmth of the hangar, as if the air were being drawn from a different climate altogether. He pressed his ear to the vent, and for a moment, the low humming stopped, replaced by the sound of something shifting behind the concrete. A slow, deliberate, dragging noise. It sounded like heavy fabric being pulled across a rough surface, followed by a faint metallic clinking that echoed deep within the hidden space. Arthur stood up quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs, and backed away toward the center of the room. The beam of his flashlight caught the edge of the fused hydraulic press, and he realized the metal was now glowing with a very faint internal luminescence. The luminescence was so dim that Arthur initially thought it was a trick of his tired eyes, a faint echo left behind by his flashlight's glare on the polished floor. He clicked the light off and the hangar fell into a thick, almost living darkness, a darkness that seemed to press gently against him, as if it carried its own quiet weight. In that stillness, the fused machinery began to glow softly, ghostly, its blue-gray radiance not lighting the room so much as revealing the strange, distorted shapes of the metal itself. It was a cold kind of light, one that offered no shadows, only outlines, pulsing in slow rhythm with the low, steady hum he could feel vibrating through the soles of his boots. He stood frozen in the center of the floor, his breath hitching in the sudden silence that followed the humming's cessation. The air grew rapidly colder, the unexplained warmth of the hangar vanishing as if a door had been opened to the winter night, yet the massive sliding doors remained sealed. Across the floor, the thermal scars began to shimmer, the glass like concrete reflecting the faint glow from the press until the entire room looked like a dark pool of water. Arthur reached into his coat pocket for his notebook, but his fingers were numb, and the simple task of grasping a pencil felt like a monumental effort. The dragging sound behind the rear wall began again, this time closer and more insistent, accompanied by a rhythmic thudding that shook the concrete blocks. It was the sound of something heavy and solid being moved with great difficulty through a narrow corridor. Arthur realized then that the missing 6 feet of the building's length wasn't just a structural void, it was a functioning space, a hidden chamber that ran the entire width of the hangar. He moved toward the wall again, drawn by a professional curiosity that managed to momentarily override his mounting dread. He found a second vent near the ceiling, partially obscured by a rusted junction box, and used his flashlight to peer inside the narrow aperture. The light didn't hit a back wall. Instead, it traveled deep into a dark, horizontal shaft that seemed to extend far beyond the exterior limits of the building. The walls of the shaft were lined with reflective foil that had been meticulously taped over every inch of the surface, creating a shimmering, mirrored tunnel. At the far end of his light's reach, Arthur saw a series of heavy cables, each thick as a man's arm, snaking toward a central point that he couldn't quite see. A sudden, sharp metallic crack echoed through the hangar, coming from the direction of the fused hydraulic press. Arthur swung his light down and saw a hairline fracture opening across the surface of the steel, a jagged split that leaked a thick, dark fluid. The substance didn't flow like oil or water. It moved with a slow, purposeful viscosity, crawling across the scorched concrete toward the rear wall. It left a trail of frost in its wake, the moisture in the air freezing instantly upon contact with the liquid. Arthur scrambled back, his boots slipping on the slick floor as he retreated toward the catwalk ladder, desperate for higher ground. From the elevated platform, he watched the dark fluid reach the base of the rear wall and begin to seep into the mortar joints between the concrete blocks. The low hum returned, rising in pitch, until it became a piercing whine that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound seemed to bypass his senses, vibrating directly into his skull and through the metal of the catwalk. The wall began to groan, the heavy blocks shifting and grinding against one another as if being pushed by a massive internal pressure. Small flakes of concrete and dust rained down from the ceiling, and Arthur saw the shadow of the rear wall start to lengthen and distort in the glow of the machinery. The internal dimensions of the hangar were visibly changing now. The rear wall was advancing toward the center of the room, reducing the floor space inch by inch. It moved with a mechanical, stuttering gait, the sound of stone on stone drowning out the high-pitched whine. Arthur looked toward the exit, but the massive sliding doors were now obscured by a thick, swirling mist that had entered through the seams of the building. The fog was heavy and smelled of wet earth and ozone, and it seemed to possess a strange internal light of its own. He realized that the airfield outside had vanished, replaced by a wall of gray that blocked out the horizon and the stars. He was no longer just in an abandoned hangar. He was inside a structure that was actively reorganizing itself around him, a physical anomaly triggered by his presence. The end. He reached for the utility phone on the catwalk, hoping to find a line to the base security office, but the receiver was dead, emitting only a series of rhythmic, clicking pulses. The pulses matched the non-coded signals he had read about in the Pamir relay reports, a heartbeat of data that had no known origin. He dropped the receiver, watching it swing on its cord like a pendulum, marking the seconds that his own watch refused to track. Below him, the dark fluid had climbed halfway up the wall, coating the concrete in a shimmering black film that looked like obsidian. The movement of the wall stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the hangar nearly 10 feet shorter than it had been when Arthur first entered. The silence that followed was absolute, a void of sound so complete that he could hear the rush of blood in his own veins. The glow from the machinery had faded to a dull ember, and the only light came from the thin beam of his flashlight, which was beginning to flicker as the batteries failed. He stayed on the catwalk, huddled against the cold railing, watching the dark film on the wall for any sign of further movement. The end. Time passed slowly as the cold intensified, making breathing difficult. He took out his notes and started to write, his handwriting messy in the dim light from his torch. He recorded the details of the environment and the unusual changes, focusing on the facts of the situation. This helped him stay calm and prevent his fear from overwhelming him. As his flashlight finally sputtered and died, Arthur heard a new sound, the distinct heavy click of a latch being turned from the inside of the rear wall. A seam appeared in the black-coated concrete, a thin vertical line of light that widened as a hidden door swung inward. There was no one on the other side, only a narrow, dimly lit corridor that smelled of old ozone and salt spray. The corridor shouldn't have existed. It occupied the exact space where the hemlock trees and the foggy airfield were supposed to be. He knew that staying on the catwalk meant freezing to death in the dark, but the corridor offered a path into a geometry that defied every rule of his profession. He climbed down the ladder, his joints stiff and aching, and approached the open seam in the wall with a sense of resigned inevitability. The black fluid had hardened into a smooth, glass-like substance, forming a ramp that led directly into the heart of the hidden structure. Arthur stepped over the threshold, and as he did, the heavy concrete door began to slide shut behind him, sealing with a sound like a tomb being closed. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for Arthur's shoulders, and the walls were lined with a dull, leaden sheeting that seemed to swallow the light from the recessed bulbs overhead. The floor beneath his feet was slightly inclined, descending deeper than the foundations of the hangar should have allowed. There was a peculiar lack of dust here, a level of cleanliness that felt sterile and unnatural for a building that had supposedly been abandoned for years. He walked with his hands grazing the cold metal walls, following the low, persistent thudding sound that had drawn him inside. The end? After several dozen paces, the passage opened into a small circular observation room filled with rows of analytical equipment that appeared both advanced and archaic. Glass vacuum tubes glowed with a soft orange hue alongside early transistor arrays, all of them connected by a chaotic web of copper wiring and braided shielding. In the center of the room stood a heavy cast iron pedestal supporting a glass cylinder, inside of which a single jagged shard of dark mineral suspended itself in midair. It didn't hover with the grace of a magnet. It sat there with a terrifying, absolute stillness, as if the space around it had been frozen in time. The end. Arthur approached the pedestal, his surveyor's instinct guiding him gently, urging him to search for the mechanical source of the suspension. Yet there was nothing. No fans, no wires, no visible force at all. Beside the cylinder rested a stack of field notes, bound in a worn leather folder, the name on the cover matching that of a technician reported missing from the base in 1954. He opened the folder, finding page after page filled with dense, frantic calculations, quiet murmurs of spatial displacement and non-thermal molecular fusion. And then the final entry. Not a formula, but a single, steady sentence, lingering like a held breath. The structure is not a container for the object. The object is the anchor for the structure. He realized then that the shifting walls of Hangar 12 were not a malfunction, but a side effect of the shard's presence, a quiet reaction to a material that did not belong in a three-dimensional world. The thermal scars on the hangar floor were the points where the building's reality had begun to fray and blend with the mineral's influence. As he read, the thudding sound grew louder, gently vibrating the floor plates until the glass cylinder began to rattle against its iron base. The shard remained perfectly motionless, yet the air around it started to shimmer, like heat rising from a summer road. Panic finally took hold as Arthur noticed the walls of the observation room beginning to contract, the lead sheeting buckling and folding inward. The hidden corridor he had entered through was narrowing, the metal groaning as it was crushed by the weight of the shifting concrete outside. He grabbed the missing technician's folder and turned to run, but the floor tilted sharply, sending him sprawling against a bank of clicking machinery. The low-frequency hum returned, now so loud it was no longer a sound, but a physical pressure that squeezed the air from his lungs. The end. He scrambled back into the narrowing corridor, his heart hammering in his ears, moving through the freezing mist that poured from the seams in the ceiling. The door to the hangar was only a sliver of light in the distance, and he could hear the heavy concrete blocks grinding shut with a finality that felt like a mountain collapsing. He pushed himself through the closing gap, his jacket catching on the rough stone, and he tumbled onto the polished floor of the main hangar just as the seam faded into a solid, featureless wall. The end? Arthur lay on the cold concrete for a long time, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the silence of the airfield returned. The luminescence in the fused machinery had died out, and the thermal scars were once again nothing more than strange, scorched patterns on a warehouse floor. He sat up and looked at his wristwatch. The second hand was moving again, but the date display showed that 12 hours had passed in what he had perceived as 40 minutes. He looked at the rear wall, measuring it with his eyes one last time, and found it was back in its original, documented position. The end. He left Hangar 12 without looking back, the declassified folder clutched tightly against his chest as he navigated the foggy tarmac toward his car. The base remained as silent and desolate as he had found it, but the weight of the missing technician's notes felt like a leaden anchor in his pocket. He knew that his official report would mention only the structural instability and the environmental hazards, as there were no words in a surveyor's lexicon for what he had actually seen. Some mysteries are protected not by locks or guards, but by the sheer impossibility of their existence. The end. The files on the 1968 incident at the coastal airfield were eventually sealed under a secondary classification, and the hangar was demolished in 1974, the site leveled and covered with 6 feet of reinforced concrete. No further records of the thermal scars or the molecular fusion were ever released to the public. To this day, the local maps of the Olympic Peninsula show only an empty, forested stretch of coastline where the runways once sat. But for those who know where to look, the ground there remains strangely warm, even in the deepest grip of winter. The end. Arthur Vance resigned his position 3 weeks later, leaving behind a career and a house that he felt no longer fit the world he lived in. His field notes were never found, though a single hand-drawn map of Hangar 12 was discovered years later, tucked inside a book on geometry in a public library. The truth of Hangar 12 remains buried under the concrete, a physical anomaly that the records simply chose to forget.